Okay, let's talk about equalization or EQ in the hopes of getting this going and keeping it going quickly. Um, I like this image because it kind of shows how instruments sit in a mix and how can we get a vocal to kind of be focused and in its place. And the kick drum, I never put the bass off to the left. I don't know about all that. But to share the space with different instruments. And it's not just about panning, although we see left and right here. If we have an 808 down here and a kick up, what can we do to make the puzzle pieces come together? And in a lot of ways, that can be done using EQ, and it is done using EQ. So what is equalization? I like to say that it's the process of kind of sculpting. You are boosting or cutting certain frequencies, the amplitude of certain frequencies. So we're going to talk about amplitude in a second. It's measured in decibels, essentially volume. And frequencies are measured in hertz. And you can think of frequency as far as pitch. There's low pitches and high pitches. And we tend to use EQ in an additive way when we accentuate frequencies that we like, that we want to bring out in a particular instrument or sound, and then we cut subtractively certain frequencies that either are not pleasing to the ear or that we want to cut because they are masking the clarity of another sound or instrument. Oftentimes we'll refer to a vocal, if you listen to a vocal just on its own, that it's a little boxy or it's a little nasal. You can find those frequencies and cut them in order to bring out more clarity in the vocal. But with like a kick and a bass, or especially an 808 and a bass, let's stick with kick, they're going to share some frequencies on the low end. And we need to sometimes cut a frequency out of the kick so that that particular set of frequencies in the bass can come out more clearly. So with frequency, sound is essentially vibrations in the air. That's why we see waveforms. And frequency is how often those vibrations occur per second. The lower the frequency, the fewer the vibrations, the longer the waveforms, or the fewer of them in a given period of time. And frequency and pitch are directly related. Pitch is the musical tone based on the number of vibrations. So the higher the frequency, the higher the pitch. Amplitude is that signal that signals that sound's loudness or volume. It's measured in decibels. And when we talk about it in EQ, it is the amount of a particular frequency that we're cutting or adding to, or a range of frequencies. And we'll talk about that as we go with bandwidth. All right, so this is a higher amplitude signal. This is a lower amplitude signal. When we look at a graphic representation of EQ, we are looking at an XY axis, where the x-axis represents frequency and the y-axis represents amplitude plus or minus, because remember, we are adding or subtracting. A couple of fun facts here. Humans supposedly can hear from 20 hertz up to 20 kilohertz or 20,000 hertz. And as you age, that frequency range goes down, especially in the high end. Number two, 440 hertz is essentially the note A2 on the piano. Or when you're tuning your A string on a guitar, if you use a tuner, you're tuning to 440 hertz. So actually, here's a little demo of that. So this is a note that is A on a piano, and I'm using the signal generator to show or to play back 440 hertz. Real quick, let's see if this works. I'm going to bring this frequency up to the point that I can no longer hear it. Can you hear it? I cannot. I always like to do that to kids because their ears start to bleed, metaphorically. Okay, so the main parameters of EQ are amplitude, like we already talked about, the volume, frequency, and then bandwidth, also referred to as Q in a lot of different EQs, is the range beyond the center point of the frequency. And let's see, I'm going to put an EQ on this kick drum. So we're going to use the EQ 37 band. So if I pull up, let's say, about 2000, all right, so I'm in the high mid frequencies. And this is a parametric EQ, and we'll get to that a little bit more. But you have your lows, your low mids, your high mids, and your highs, and you have two filters. If I take, let's see, I have my Q, which is my bandwidth, but it's easier to see in a minute. I'm going to raise 2000, roughly 2000. I'm going to do it a lot. Okay, so I brought it up by, let's go to 10 or so. All right, so 10 decibels up, amplitude, 2000 hertz or 2 kilohertz. And then as I adjust the Q or the bandwidth, how much of the surrounding frequencies am I bringing along with it? All right, so let's hear what a rather wide boost of 2000 here sounds like. Sorry. First I'll bypass this. Okay, you can hear much more of the beater hitting the drum head. Now, is that nice? I don't know. It's not about what it is. It's not about fitting in the mix at the moment. But some types of music you like to hear that beater. Now let's see if I can do this real quick. I'm going to make this a little bit longer so that I can narrow the Q. I'm going to go up, so this is really obvious. Okay, so you can hear that it's not as obvious when it's a narrow Q, but I might be looking for a particular harmonic. So you can really get surgical with these things. And you can do that in a subtractive way as well. So if you hear something that you really don't like, you can kind of find it and cut it and be very specific and surgical about it. All right, so bandwidth, also referred to as Q, amplitude, and frequency. Types of EQ. You don't see this a lot in DAWs. I mean, you do, actually. I take that back. But graphic EQs, which are fixed frequencies and bandwidths that are on these sliders, when they're in the middle, they're at 0, essentially doing nothing, and you raise them or you cut them. In live sound, we use them to eliminate feedback. So you kind of make a microphone feedback, and then you find the particular frequency and you cut it, because rooms tend to send certain frequencies into feedback depending on the type of space. Talking about, well, let's talk about different types. Keep going. So a peak is essentially this. Oops, I'm already running out of battery. Cheapy. So this is a peak EQ, effectively. And we'll talk about that in the context of parametric. All right, it's right here. A shelf. Let me put this back. So this one is set. You can do either peak or shelf. So a shelf is essentially that everything above the chosen frequency goes up. And a filter, like a high-pass filter that I have always called a low-cut filter, which makes more sense to me, essentially cuts everything below a certain frequency. And you can change how steep that cut is, depending on what it is that you're trying to achieve. Very, very common to put high-pass filters on just about anything where the majority of the audible content isn't in that frequency range. So for a guitar, I would cut some lows. Vocals, I would cut lows. Bass and kick, probably not. Strings, piano, probably not, because we want some of that resonance down in the low end. And then parametric is essentially how I explained EQ, where you have control over the bandwidth, the frequency, and the amplitude. So with this EQ, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 parametric bands, 2 of which, the lows and the highs, can be used as shelves. And we also have 2 filters. And filters essentially cut whatever you above or below whatever you choose. So if you imagine cutting all the highs, and actually the, what is this one called? The Airkill EQ. That one, when you load that up, essentially is saying cut everything but the mids. That's going to sound pretty bad. Okay, and you can adjust what that mid is in terms of lows and highs. All right. Anyways, that I use the Airkill much more for an effect as opposed to a sculpting tool, because you can't really sculpt with filters alone. And I think that's kind of enough for our intro to EQ. What I'm going to do is give you an exercise to kind of train your ears. But I did want to point out we have a few other EQs in the studios, software EQs. This is a classic API, which is a peak EQ, which just gives you essentially some fixed frequencies and amplitude across different ranges. The SSL has shelf and peak in the highs and lows, similar to the 7-band, and then 2 bands of parametric. So here you have amplitude, frequency, and Q. Although this says low mid. No, this is just, yeah. No, I'm sorry. This is amplitude. This is bandwidth. I'm not wearing my glasses. Anyhow, there you go. EQ.